But the biggest thrill of the whole thing was at the end. You know, I mean, when Bruno came out of retirement, and the way that was set up week after week after week, to where the fans were so sucked into it. People actually loved Bruno. I mean, the mentality of the human race still tended to believe whatever they saw on television. Still were naive to certain things. And you can see the difference from today, where like even with the Donald Trump president thing, people aren't stupid anymore. They're smart to everything, and that includes lying, crooked politicians. They're throwing them out. They'd rather have a WWE Hall of Famer as the president than a politician who they know is a crook. So the people mentality back then, they really loved. When Bruno got bloody in the ring, people in the audience had heart attacks and died. Little old Italian guys were carried out on stretchers because they were so emotionally involved. And that's what led to the hottest kind of feud of the end of that era of the old school with me and Bruno, was when Bruno broke his neck and couldn't do it. And then Billy Graham wound up with Backlund wound up with the belt, and the business was dying. I knew that people weren't ready yet for Bruno to be gone. You know, he broke his neck, it wasn't planned. And I knew, I could feel it, and from everything I was taught, by Bruno and the other guys over the years, whoever taught Bruno into making one comeback would be the hottest thing in wrestling, because that's where all the publicity came out of those days, with the magazines all over the country, and you became a big star wrestling Bruno in the Garden. And I came up with this idea, and then I called Bruno, and it was headbutting, and then some headbutting with the McMahons, because in those days the heels were 300 pounds, big scary guys, and I was 240, Bruno's protege, the good guy. So the McMahons were kind of leery of it, didn't know if I would get over, because they're the ones that, if I don't draw, I don't draw, but they're the ones stuck with the bill and had to pay for the Garden. And so, but it worked out, it worked out great, because I was right. People wanted to see when Bruno came back and I stabbed him in the back. It was the hottest thing. I mean, it blew wrestling away. We broke records, plus Shea Stadium, which in those days was unheard of. If there were pay-per-views in those days, it would have been the biggest buy rate ever.
Right.
And then, if you look at the history of it, we didn't know back then.
But just for the record, it wasn't Hulk Hogan, as he said in his book, that drew the crowd.
No, Hogan, he puts himself over for doing everything. I came up with the idea because I knew, I could feel with what was going on and how the territory was, going downhill money-wise.
Is it true it was almost bankrupt at one point?
Well, it was on the verge of bankruptcy, because it wasn't their only business. There was Vince Sr., there was Phil Zacco, there was Willie Gilzenberg, and not just with the wrestling. They were boxing fans and would give money to promote boxers. They had their private booths at the racetrack. I mean, they lived a great life, but it was kind of that month-to-month life, and they made money like off the Garden. But if the Garden didn't draw money, because the Garden was expensive. The Garden took like 70% of everything.
Right, it still is.
Yeah, it's prestige, but they take a lot. So if the Garden didn't make money, Vince Sr. didn't make money. So, but so back in those days, I just knew that if Bruno would do it, it was money.
And how did you convince him?
Well, I talked to him on the phone a bunch and just kept telling him that, I know anybody gets you in ring. I mean, it would be the biggest break. And back then, I was Bruno's protege for some years. So in terms of the fans and the promoters, that's what I was kind of labeled. It wasn't like, Larry Zbyszko. It was like, Bruno's kid. You're Bruno's protege. It's got some guys didn't even know my name. You're Bruno's protege. So it was a way for me to kind of get out of that shadow, because he was so huge. And Bruno said, okay, for you, I'll do it. But now this is how I learned even more, is Bruno was the one that had week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, so the people would...
Okay, so he came up with the actual booking.
Yeah, he was the expert at that. He was the one that did it for 18 years, and that's why he was over for 18 years.
Okay, so he had to play all the time in the booking of his
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, when it came to him, he did his own, and
I see. So he came up with the technical wrestling match, and then when he was trying to interview you, you walking away.
Well, I came up with a couple of things, but in terms of the technical match, and then some other stuff in the garden, and that was all Bruno stuff. And at first, the McMahons didn't want to go for it because they didn't know they're going to put up all this money for the gardens and the stadiums, and it's Larry Zbyszko. If I didn't draw it, they're busted.
Right.
But then after a while, after it happened, after the first week set in, because I went to some places and it was sold out and people went nuts, and McMahon's knew, oh, this worked. In fact, it was so hot for those days, it was the talk of the business because it was just ridiculous.
And who came up with the idea to have the blow off in Shea Stadium?
Well, it just kind of worked out that way because it was so big. There was so much demand for tickets. The garden wasn't big enough.
Right.
The garden, even with the Felt Forum open, maybe held 22,000 or something. Which they always
3 sellouts in so something like that, right?
Which was kind of unheard of for a run in those days. But that was at raised ticket prices. But so they just had an opportunity to do the stadium thing, and then there might have been something with the date too at the Garden. So Vince finally said, "Hey, hell, we'll take a chance. It's over." And it worked. I mean, the fire chief wouldn't let any more people come in the baseball park wouldn't let us put chairs on the ground. So we had to turn away thousands of people, with 45,000 people in the place.
Did they ever have any consideration at that time when you were so hot to actually make you the WWE champion?
Well, I think there was some talk about it, and to be honest with you, me and Vince Sr. had like a kind of like a little beef over it because I thought I should. Because I was the one drawing and the one that people were into and the one that people hated, and Bob they didn't care about.
Been champion for a while by that time.
And even Vince Sr. said to me, "Well, I know Bob, isn't wrong, but he just liked him, and so we just left it that way."
And you ended up getting 5% of that Shea Stadium gate, I guess?
Yeah, I think I was 5%, and Bruno got like 5.5%, a little bit more than me. Or maybe 6%, 1% more. There was some deal going on. But I learned a lot. I basically did what Bruno said because I didn't know that stuff. That was old school top guy. If you weren't a top guy, you couldn't do that.
Right.
If you were someone who went up to visit and said, "Hey, I think I better get this money out the door," you'd be. So it was stuff that really no one knew except a couple. You had to be a top guy to pull it off, and I didn't know this. But that's how I learned. I learned the hard way.
Do you think that's why, despite how much heat you had, they kind of got rid of you very shortly after that Bruno match?
Well, yeah, there was probably kind of, some asshole. But they didn't try to get rid of me right away. But there were some games being played.
Right.
And it was kind of interesting because they would say like, "Hey, I think you should wrestle Pedro Morales 3 times in Boston." So right away you say to yourself, "Oh God, well for the next 3 or 4 months I'm going to make a bunch of money because I'm going to be the main event here for 3 months and the main event." And then when you get to there,
because in those days the main event made more
than the money. Match. Oh yeah, that's where the money.
Got a percentage of the card according to where you were.
And then what deal you had with them. But then when I got there, things would change and they would expect, like Pedro maybe to win, and I would only do a 1 shot instead of the other 2, and I'd say, "I can't do that, that wasn't the deal." So you had to stand up for yourself too.
Right.
So after a few of those, it got to the point where, and Bruno actually told me to do this because Bruno never beat me.
Right.
He walked out of the cage so I wouldn't get killed, but he never beat me in any shows.
Right.
And he did that on purpose, so I had an excuse to use and say, "Hey, Bruno never beat me, so can't make Bruno look bad."
Yeah.
And then, Skolin and Fanini and Monsoon would go, "Yeah, well, that's right." So I used that, but then it was time, really, because I had so much publicity. If I would have stayed there, they would have tried to use all the heat up, and probably, I'm sure maybe Vince would would have liked to punch me in the face back then. But now we love each other with the respect, because I think he's great, and we get along great. So it worked out good. It's a good ending to a hell of a story.